Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, and we are very fortunate to have a return appearance by Vanessa Beeley, who is, of course, a very well-known blogger, podcaster, and expert on the Middle East. And of course, she spent a number of years living in Syria. She's not in Syria now, obviously. And who's the best person really to consult on what's going on in Syria and what the likely prospects are other than Vanessa Beeley. So thank you so much, Vanessa, for giving us your valuable time. Perhaps before we get onto the bigger questions, maybe you could say something about your personal circumstances and how this very dramatic events over the past couple of weeks, unfolded and how much they impacted on you and how you managed to escape from Syria.
And on top of that, before you answered, you actually previewed all of this with the last time you spoke to George and I. So go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, basically, and I have to say, I'm incredibly fortunate because I managed to get out. I do have a British passport, which at the time that I left, although actually nobody among the armed groups that were in control of the border when I managed to get out even asked to see any papers. But I'm kind of quite clearly foreign. I don't look Syrian, and they were too busy looting and plundering and stealing from all of the shops leading up to the border. All of the houses where I was actually living were being looted as I was leaving, the ones that had been left empty. And so they were so drunk on their victory and so intent on the looting and plundering and the fighting amongst themselves over the spoils that they didn't really pay much attention. The only danger was, of course, trying to actually force our car through the kind of packed area with trucks and motorcycles and guns
I'm sorry
and
to
armed
interrupt, but
groups.
you said something which I'm sure will affect Peter deeply. You had 5 dogs and you had to leave
Yeah,
4 of them behind.
I actually had 6 dogs, and I had to leave 5 behind, which was just like when I was told. I'm getting mixed up with days now. When did I actually leave? On the Sunday. I think I mentioned previously that there were confusing messages. At one point, I had a phone call saying you have to leave in the next hour. Then I spoke to somebody else who was saying, no, it's all cool. The president is still here. Everybody's relaxed, and there's going to be a ceasefire. So I was like, because in all honesty, I didn't want to make that decision to leave my dogs behind anyway. So I was probably myself grasping on straws and saying, oh, great, okay, there'll be a ceasefire, probably knowing in my subconscious that that wasn't really going to happen. But I'm human at the end of the day, and they're like my kids. So in the end, after a night of sort of fairly horrific experience of sort of being alone in the house, only with the dogs, and having the armed groups all around the houses in that area firing their guns and shooting into the garden quite regularly, although the wall is pretty high, but they were just randomly shooting and the bullets were ending up in the garden. Israel was bombing extensively for the first time with the bunker buster bomb, so the house was shaking from top to bottom. Nobody really knew who the groups were that were there because in Syria there's no electricity, so everything was plunged into darkness anyway. So there was no way that I was going to kind of go out in the street with all of these guns going off, because they're quite capable of killing you, even if they're not aiming at you from the bullets coming back down. And then in the morning, basically, I was talking backwards and forwards with various people in Lebanon and Syria, and I was being told the border at Masna, which is the main border, was actually closed because there were no police and no security and no army there. They'd all laid down their arms and gone. So the border in Syria side was empty. And then I was packed at this stage. I decided which dog I would take, because it's the one that really wouldn't survive if I left her alone. So the German Shepherd came with me, and the other 5 I had to leave behind.
Did you
They
leave
are
them
being taken care of.
Okay, I was going to ask.
No, I mean, we couldn't
of?
move.
Yeah.
Well, we couldn't move, and the idea was that after I left, a friend in Syria would take 2 of them, and then the other 2 would come to Lebanon, and we would sort of rehome them here. But then the whole of the area where I was living was occupied, not necessarily by HTS, but by the kind of criminal gangs from the surroundings, like Wadi Barada, which is I think the major water supply to Damascus. If you remember, in 2017, the terrorists took control of it and cut off water supply to Damascus. And they were at the 2 checkpoints that are at the entrance to the area where I was living, and they were not allowing anyone in or anyone out. So thank God I had a friend in the area who's going every day to take care of them and to feed them. Otherwise, I was panicking because they would be left alone. There was potential of the house getting broken into and them either getting let loose on the street or shot, worst case scenario, and the house being looted, because I literally took 1 suitcase and 1 dog and a few random bags, because I didn't even have anything big to pack everything into, and I couldn't carry everything anyway. So the majority of the life that I'd kind of gathered over the last 5 years was left behind.
Okay, over the last 5 years.
Sorry. Yeah.
I mean, George, when was the last time we talked? Like a month ago?
Maybe even less than that. Maybe about 3 or
Even
3
less
weeks
than
ago.
that.
Yeah.
Vanessa, how it happened really fast, obviously, but explain to us, you already had a sense that I think you said, Syria is next. I think those were the words. And we both, George and I tend to agree with you. What was it like over the last month? I mean, was it just, what is Hemingway said, bankruptcy, once it happens really fast. Okay. I mean, was there a some kind of progression, or was there just a snap and then everything hell breaks loose?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this, and if I think it was just before the ceasefire.
Yeah.
And I had said that, I couldn't understand how people were describing this as a victory for the resistance, because in my opinion, Netanyahu would never have accepted the ceasefire terms, as he never did with Hamas, if they were not to his advantage.
Yeah,
and the only way
that, and we agreed with you. Yeah.
Yeah. And the only way that I could interpret that was that it would be a pivot towards Syria. But in all honesty, I think myself and many other people in Syria expected it to be an Israeli direct attack. So we were expecting the kind of the bombing and the attacks on Syrian military installations, yes. And even potentially attacks on supply routes and weapons manufacturing and research and development centers and so on. I'd been talking about that for some time. But I don't think any of us expected the scale of the attack from not only HTS and Idlib, but also the SNA, the formerly Free Syrian Army that were under the control of Turkey, and the triggering of various ISIS factions leading up to the invasion from the northwest. When I said we didn't expect it, there had been expectation for a number of months. I'd been talking about it for a long time, the dangers and the risks, when one looked at the areas that were still occupied in Syria and were still effectively controlled by the US, by Turkey, more recently by Ukraine and Idlib, by Israel in the south, the separatist movements in the south that had been ongoing for now a couple of years under the backing of Israel. So Syria had always been in a precarious position, and I'd always talked about that. And we had received warning about 2 to 3 months ago that Jolani was planning a major attack. However, Jolani at some point stood down. So there was a degree of, I won't say complacency, because there were 30,000 troops in Aleppo, prepared for in the event of any forward movement by the forces in Idlib. but we'll get into more detail, I guess, in a minute. But I think the sheer scale of the attack, they'd had 5 years to prepare. They'd had NATO member state specialists helping them to prepare. And then, as I mentioned more recently, Ukraine, they'd had support from Turkey. Turkey to date had 150 military bases in the north and sort of entering the northwest to a degree, and it was providing surveillance.
Do you think this was a NATO planned operation?
I think this was a kind of a triad of the United States, Turkey, and Israel. And I think it had been planned for some time. And I think the idea was to, particularly because this all combines with the election of Trump. And I'd been saying for some time, when it became very clear to me that Trump was going to win the election, I don't believe in elections. I don't believe there's any kind of electoral process in the United States. I think the presidents are chosen according to the point at which we are on the deep state military industrial complex roadmap. And if we remember back in 2016, when Trump came in, it kind of disunited the resistance axis and the non-aligned alliance, because everyone presumes that Trump is going to do deals. Right. And I think that's very much what happened this time, even from, I believe, a Russian perspective. I think they saw the potential to do a deal with Trump, potentially change the scenario in Syria. I don't have any smoking gun evidence for this. This is just me reading the situation on the ground, the actions of the Russian armed forces, the actions of the Syrian armed forces, the departure of President Assad, the subsequent Hitlerization again of Assad, the kind of Holocaust narratives coming out of Sednaya, even though Sednaya was completely that entire narrative was completely debunked back in, when was it, 2016, 2017, even by Peter Ford, former British ambassador, who said that the Amnesty International report was ridiculous.
But there was sorry, Rob, there was the meeting that Assad, which we don't know whether it really happened. Assad went to Moscow in November the 26th. I mean, there's no record of it in the Kremlin website, but people say that he did go to Moscow. Do you have any evidence that he did go, or is it just all speculation?
I think that's all speculation. I think much of what we're actually seeing on the surface level is not the reality. I mean, to give an example, the narrative that is being manufactured inside Syria is that Assad betrayed even his close people, and that he left Syria without any warning to them, without any without giving them the ability to get out of Syria, without telling them how grave the situation was. There's also, sorry, go on.
No, that's like blaming the dead guy, but keep going.
Yeah, no, exactly. And this is what I think is going on. And why? Because what does that do? That undermines and demoralizes any kind of counter-resistance efforts inside Syria. And it forces through that normalization with what is effectively Al-Qaeda and even Israel, because, you know, Israel has, well, actually now they're about 10 minutes from where my house was. So that's how far they've come in, about 20 kilometers away from the center of Damascus. And the I-24, so the Israeli kind of state media correspondent, is now reporting from inside Damascus. We've got MIT chief from Turkey inside Damascus, although I had to smile at the amount of security that he felt he needed to drive through in a bulletproof car through the center of Damascus. That kind of also sends a message that they're not entirely welcome, except through intimidation and repression, of course, almost in the first 24 hours. And I'm sure Erdogan is going to come in and go and pray at the Umayyad Mosque, because that's what he promised he would do back in 2012. But I think we're seeing something which is very typical of a kind of CIA, MI6, Mossad type narrative management going on to ensure the complete dispersion of any elements within Syria that are allied with Iran or with the resistance axis. We're seeing it because the Shia communities are leaving. I mean, they're basically at the border trying to get through into Lebanon right now.
But the NTS, all of HTS, all of these groups is getting so much coverage in the Western media and rebranding them and all that. But Vanessa, this looks like the regime gave up. It just collapsed. Okay, that's what it more because Kevork very well in Berlin. I mean, not only is he very pessimistic, he's actually very furious because being an Armenian Syrian. He sees that it collapsed within. It didn't really need a big push. How do you feel about that narrative?
Kevork and I disagree on this.
Well,
Which is fine. That's fine.
As I like to say to our viewers, I mean, we come from a certain narrative, and even within that narrative, there's a lot of differences, and I think that's very healthy. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And I haven't stopped speaking to people, let's say, who were in the government, were close to the leadership and so on. And I would say it's a divided camp. There are those that are in the mindset of Kevork where they feel that the president betrayed them. I'm more of the mindset, and there are many people also of that mindset, where I don't believe the president that gave the speech that he did at the Arab League summit, where he shamed the majority, particularly of the Gulf state leaders, but also of the Arab state leaders, for not doing enough to prevent the genocide in Palestine. It was one of the strongest speeches that he's given. And also a president who, throughout his presidency, has been so consistent. Whether you disagree with him or not, he has never deviated from his policy, from his vision. That was one of the reasons that historically Syria has been a target since 1946 onwards, was one, its relationship with the Soviet Union and then with Russia, perhaps even more importantly than its relationship with Iran, which only really came to the fore after 2005 when Syria withdrew from Lebanon, and then Iran had a more central role in supporting Hezbollah and the Palestinian resistance and so on. So the other camp is basically saying they don't believe that the president would have done that. But if he was in a situation where some deal had been made and where he had to relinquish power and he was under instructions to not inform anyone, because that would create this narrative of demoralization and betrayal and so on, and therefore discredit him in the eyes of even his closest supporters. Now, I could be completely wrong on this, but it's not only my reading of it. I've been speaking to various ambassadors who were in Damascus and who were, let's say, with the non-aligned
this is very interesting what you're saying, because the stories that we're getting from Iran and from Russia is that somehow, well, we were willing to help Assad, but Assad kept turning down our offers of help. And that just never really made any sense. I mean, why would somebody like Assad, who's in a weak, vulnerable position, turn down offers of help? I mean, what do you think of that?
Yeah. Well, again, that's another aspect of the narrative where people are saying in recent years he pivoted towards Saudi Arabia and UAE. But people need to understand, the state of Syria. I mean, it was sort of on the verge of a failed state. The only thing that had kept it together was really the presidency. There were huge problems with the government, and there were problems in the sense that, this is my opinion, that President Assad had a kind of hands-off role. In other words, he expected the institutions that he was delegating decision-making to make the right decisions. And I think sometimes that's dangerous, even in a corporate company environment, which I've worked in. You don't do that. You still have to keep a very hands-on approach, just as I believe Putin does to a large degree. He keeps a hands-on approach in all sectors, despite creating the complex that can deal with all of those different areas and sectors. And Syria was struggling financially for very obvious reasons. Iran was not in a position to provide financial help. Russia was certainly not in a position to provide financial help. China was, to a degree, trying to provide some kind of investment help, but then sanctions were preventing it because Trump brought in these Caesar sanctions, which would penalize anyone that came to the assistance of Syria. So I think when the UAE, in my opinion, came in on behalf of the United States and that entire alliance to kind of try again to bring Assad back on board. And when it became very clear that he wasn't going to come back on board, then I think they went to plan B, which may well involve Trump offering some kind of negotiation settlement with Russia. This will come out in the future, and I'm not, this is just how I'm reading it, because you talk about the collapse, but I can also tell you that from on the ground, when the terrorists were attacking West Aleppo on the east, the brigade that was under the command of one general was standing firm. And at that point, Commander Kessel left and went back to Hamamim and took all of the Russian soldiers that were there alongside the 25th Brigade back to Hamamim. And in the end, the 25th Brigade was left isolated in the east, and they had to withdraw to the south. And then they had the battles in Knasa to liberate the Nubal and Zara people and the military cadets that had been trapped in the area to the south of Aleppo.
I read somewhere. Sorry. I read somewhere
No, sorry.
That Assad had gone to the Russians and said he would leave Damascus, but he would create a kind of a rump Syrian state based in Latakia, which is basically that's where the Alawites are located, and that's where, of course, the Russian military bases and the ports is located. And the Russians rejected that offer. Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, I did hear something along those lines. And there were a number of kind of rumors circulating around it was only really 11 days that it took from the invasion of Aleppo to then come to Hamar. In Homs, I know there was a very strong pushback, particularly because at that point Hezbollah forces had joined Iranian forces and Syrian Arab Army forces that were not standing down and fought back. But the sheer onslaught was, from what I was hearing from soldiers on the ground during the battles, was very hard to deal with, and in particular, of course, the use of drone warfare against Syrian army positions. And at some point between Homs and Damascus, Russia seemed to stop bombing the terrorist lines. So at that point, it seemed that even Russia kind of backed off. And I have seen, which kind of break my heart. I've seen this video circulating of this Russian Humvee driving past all of these lines of dejected-looking Syrian army soldiers. And, I do want to say one thing. When you consider the vast swaths of territory that the Syrian army liberated over the last 14 years against, again, overpowering forces and disproportionate weapons capability and equipment, provided by NATO member states, Turkey, Israel, etc., to these groups, compared to the Syrian army soldiers who were living on literally nothing, had very, very outdated and very sort of bad equipment, really. It used to kind of break my heart when I used to see the army and what they actually managed to do with what little they had. The blame doesn't lie with the average soldier. It really doesn't. In my opinion, it never does. It lies with the command and what happened among the command on the field, and not all the command caved. Not all of them caved. I know that for a fact.
Vanessa, is Syria a state any longer? Has it collapsed? It's a
How can it be? It has no, Israel has destroyed, what is it? They're claiming 80% of Syria's military capability.
Oh, yeah, well, when they say military, I read infrastructure, but keep going.
Yeah, of course, yes. But nevertheless, they've destroyed their air defense. They've destroyed what little they had left of the navy and the oil tankers and so on at Latakia. They've destroyed research and development centers. And of course, it became very obvious that HTS's role also was at the same time to reveal all of the supply lines to Hezbollah and destroy them, or at least point them out to Israel, and to enter and destroy the research and development centers that for years have been developing Syria's capability to defend itself against Israel and against the, any hostile or normalized states with Israel in the region if it comes to any kind of escalation. So yeah, I mean, how can you describe it as a state? It has an illegitimate terrorist government that's claiming it's going to be all inclusive, carrying out sectarian programs across the country, driving, either ethnically cleansing through mass extermination or displacing them. As I've said, there's a multitude of Shia communities waiting at the Syrian border to be able to enter Lebanon right now, to either come to Lebanon or to go to Iraq. So they've been entirely displaced. Christians they're not necessarily being persecuted, but it's starting to creep in that they're not allowed to celebrate Christmas. They're not allowed to even have Christmas lunch unless they sort of keep the sound down. No bells. They're not allowed to have Father Christmases and Christmas tree. I mean, Damascus was the most wonderful Christmas celebration because you had Orthodox, you had Catholic, you had so many different denominations. You had about 5 weeks of Christmas, and the ones who enjoyed it the most were the Muslims. The ones taking selfies in front of the huge Christmas trees were always the Muslims living in Damascus, and that's going to go. And it's the fact that Syria's secular, really kind of modern progressive society, despite maintaining the values of community and family and so on, is going to go. And that's the most, everything is heartbreaking, to be honest. It's very difficult to kind of maintain an even keel emotionally over it because this was my home for 5 years. I loved it there despite all the difficulties, and there were many, but it was a state constantly under siege and blockade and war and threat.
Mm-hmm. So what happens now in the in the immediate future? And does Israel now take a large slice of Syria in the south? Does Erdogan take his slice in the north? How do you see this the immediate developments?
It looks like a partition is in play right now.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah, and I think this was planned between Erdogan and Israel, but also Qatar, because you can't ignore the Muslim Brotherhood connection between Turkey and Qatar was the main sponsor of the regime change war against Syria from 2011 onwards. They poured billions into it, and they are the supporters of the kind of Muslim Brotherhood factions that were the Free Syrian Army, are now the SNA under the control of Turkey. And we're seeing already the SNA is in territories to the east of the Euphrates. So Turkey is basically taking that slice across the northern sector of Syria from Aleppo across. Israel has come in. It has control pretty much over Sweda, Dara, Quneitra, and it's come up along the Syrian border almost to the main Syrian border. So potentially it's going to take control of the border. And it will be, as I've said, right now, it's about 20 kilometers from the center of Damascus. But I don't think it's going to stop there. I think Israel and the United States are going to continue up the southeastern and the eastern border as far as Iraq. And eventually they will want to also create a channel through Iraq to the border of Iran. That's my reading of it. And even Iran now is talking about the 11,000 ISIS terrorists that are ready and waiting inside Iraq to start the destabilization campaign there. And of course, they can be joined from Tanif, where the US has been incubating ISIS and various other armed groups for years, and Rukban camp, which is another recruitment camp just to the south of Tanif. So I think that entire corridor is designed to at least come under the surveillance of Israel and the US in order to do exactly what they've done to Lebanon, isolate the borders. So no one can come into Syria from Iran, Iraq. then potentially they'll move on to Iraq and then do the same on the border there with Iran. And then, of course, we face the potential for direct war with Iran.
But
That's my
what happens to Lebanon during this process? It's fascinating what you're saying, but I mean the Americans and Israel must be licking their chops right now. Is that this is a very opportune time for a regime change in Lebanon?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, again, the threat in Lebanon, which has been deliberately manufactured, is that a huge number of the extremists that were fighting in Syria came to Lebanon and have taken up position, for example, in the north in Tripoli. So if you look at the map of Lebanon, if Israel has control of the Syrian-Lebanese border, if HTS are on the border of Homs, between Homs and Lebanon, is there potential of an attempt of an invasion by HTS? Yes, I think there is. The one thing, I was speaking with Marwa Osman about this last night, the one thing that she pointed out to me is the Lebanese army is now fully entrenched in the south. Then there's not enough of the Lebanese army to be able to also divert it to the border with Syria in order to defend that. So what does that mean? That means that they have to ask Hezbollah for assistance to defend the border with Syria, which is not exactly going to play into the kind of the diminishment of Hezbollah as a force within Lebanon. So that might be the only thing that might tip the balance in them not actually invading Lebanon, right? But it still puts Lebanon under threat. It puts them under pressure.
And it puts Lebanon into a defensive posture. They're forced. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, they don't have air defense because the US has ensured since Syria took out its air defense in 2005, or rather it left it behind. But I mean, Lebanon has no air defense because the US has deliberately been sponsoring the Lebanese army to a point where it can't defend itself in any way, shape, or form against Israel or against any serious attack on Lebanese territory.
What do you think is going to happen to the Russian bases, the Tartus and the
Tartus, Khaimimim? Well, as far as I can see, I mean, Russia is negotiating now with HTS to try and maintain the base. That's something that makes me raise questions about whether there has been a kind of a backdoor deal done, because if you imagine Syria is now under the control of Turkey, Israel, the United States, NATO member states, because the US comes with the UK. Italy's one of the first to reopen their embassy there since HTS took power. The fact that Russia is able to negotiate with HTS kind of suggests to me that there is a warming of the Cold War relations, perhaps. This is me theorizing. I don't know. Peter might have another opinion on this. But that's all we're all trying to do right now, is to read the messages, read what is going on, how fast people are trying to kind of normalize with HTS, because they understand now that this is the entity in control of Syria, which is kind of terrifying when you think you've got Mohammed Aloush and his name? Jolani, sorry.
Jolani.
In blank on that, in control. Yeah, I mean, basically.
But it's very strange because when Putin intervened in 2015, I mean, one of the most important reasons that he offered, I mean, there were a number of reasons, but the one he said in public was, we don't want to see the black flag of ISIS flying over Damascus because we have a really bad experience with jihadis in Russia. We had it throughout the 1990s. They absolutely wreaked havoc in the Russian Caucasus. And so we don't want that. So once HTS is there, you're going to get jihadis in the Russian Caucasus. You're going to get jihadis in Central Asia and in China.
Well, not only that, but I mean, the deal between Ukraine and Jolani, of course, was to provide Ukraine to provide the weapons and drones and technology and training, and for Jordani to send HTS militants to Ukraine to fight alongside the ISIS that were already there to fight against Russia. So yeah, and we're already seeing the black flags. We're seeing them in Latakia. So the so-called safe rump of Syria is no longer safe, and we know that there are massacres going on in the villages around there and around Homs. So yeah, that's a major question, because in reality, HTS is, if you like, affiliated to Ukraine. So that makes it very difficult for me to understand how Russia's going to be able to maintain a military base in
it may
Syria.
be, it may be, and I'm just theorizing personally too, is the black flag has some really important domestic issues in front of it right now. There's no need to alienate the Russians now. We'll take care of them later. George and I are in agreement that the port and the airfield won't be there for long. It may be there
No.
for a while, a few months, who knows? But the United States and NATO, they want to turn the Mediterranean into a NATO lake, and Russia's base is, people make a lot of hay about it. It's a pretty small operation, okay, and what they want to plant to, well, the United States will want to plant a flag there. That's the ultimate thing they want to do. It's important to Russia, but it's not make or break. The way I look at it is they will try to do their best to keep it there as long as possible, and then when that isn't possible, they will have to withdraw. And I think
but it is a blow, because it's a war
but
more.
it's certainly a blow.
Otherwise, you become totally dependent on Turkey, to get through, the Dardanelles. Yeah,
really reliable. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So Erdogan's rubbing his hands in glee at the
Oh,
because of course
absolutely. Well, I mean, Erdogan, we don't have to waste a lot of time on him,
No.
but let's put it this way. He has a long memory, and he's been waiting for this moment to double cross the Russians. I mean, Russian media, looking at TASS and other official agencies, they're pretty mellow about it, when it comes to those bases. Okay, they still talk about terrorist group taking over Syria. That rhetoric is there, but when it comes to their geopolitical interests in the country, they're being a bit tentative right now. But I just can't see any long-term survival of those installations.
But the interesting thing is
a country that cannot control its sovereignty.
Right. But the Ukraine angle is quite interesting, because I don't think Kiev came up with this idea, hey, Zelensky, you're sitting around snorting coke, and hey, what a bloody good idea. Why don't we do some a little bit of action in Syria? No, this was NATO. NATO, they're the ones who have
no, this was
drones.
yes.
Yeah. So they're the ones who told Ukraine,
and CIA
don't do this in Syria.
and MI6, yeah, for sure.
And then Zelensky and his orbit go along with it. See, just another example how we're a valuable NATO player. Okay, I mean that's it. It's just window dressing. Okay, but it's making a point. Okay, for the Russians, they say, "See, this is what we expected from these people. You go into NATO, and you're good." And then Ukraine is part of a heist, a caper in the Middle East. Okay, that's fulfilling a narrative here. But it's Zelensky and his people grabbing it at straws, okay, saying, see, the American, I mean, what was it, George, about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, Zelensky saying, American troops can leave Europe. We'll take their place for them, okay?
Right. Yeah, they're still making that claim. Hey, we're going to be the really useful, essentially gendarme of Europe. We'll replace the Americans, and because Trump wants to bring Americans or take them to Asia to confront China, we'll replace the American gendarme in Europe. I mean, that's still Zelensky's position.
Well, Vanessa, I mean, how do Syrians move forward? I mean, Damascus was a multicultural, multi-confessional, and the likes of which are very rare today, and getting more rare. I mean, one of the things that I find very frustrating, again, we see the West particularly Israel, getting Arabs to fight Arabs, Muslims to fight Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And that for me, that's heartbreaking for me, because that's a level of cynicism. Nobody wins at the end of the day in this. Okay, it's certainly not the Arab world and not the Muslim world. I mean, I'm talking about people, average people, not about elites. But that it's really quite pathetic. I mean, George, I sent you a link earlier today. The terrorists that have taken over Damascus haven't responded to Israel taking slices of the country. I mean, if that's your central government, okay.
Yeah, but they're never going to. I mean, they've been armed and funded and promoted and healed in Israeli hospitals since
My point is,
2011.
you're right, but the point is that if you look at people on the ground, is that it's better to fight your neighbor than to fight the invader, and that's the
Yeah,
message.
but I think okay, but where I would slightly kind of disagree, and I would look at it from perhaps a different angle, is if you look at the factions that are fomenting the fighting, what are they? They're extremist factions that effectively, pretty much all of them, were created by the British from the late 1920 onwards. So you have the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, you have the Wahhabi, you have all of the extremist elements, including from Afghanistan, from all over the world. Just as
Uyghurs.
they're weaponizing, just as they're weaponizing the Nazis in Ukraine, right? And we know the connections between Zionism and the Nazism in Ukraine and so on. But it's the same. It's exactly the same. So I think it's a little bit unfair to say that Muslims are allowing themselves to be pitted against Muslims. What is happening is that the Muslim communities of all different sects are being infiltrated by these fanatics that are actually funded and created and driven by the West and by Israel and by the enemies of the Muslim nations in order to, through their brutality and through their fanaticism, to force people to resist against them. Just as Palestinians are forced to resist against the Zionists because of the Zionist fanaticism and genocidal mentality. So I think there is I would say that in Sunni camps, there is a degree also of gaslighting and mass media propaganda, a lot of it being generated by Qatar, of course, through Al Jazeera, which is what was responsible for the start of the regime change war. I would agree to that. But I would also say there's a higher level or even a lower level that is being directed to foment all of this violence and strife and
But why do you think why do you think, Vanessa, the sort of the Arab opinion turned so much against Bashar al-Assad right at the start of the civil war? Why? I mean, they kicked him out of the Arab League, and he was a persona non grata until what, 2022. Why did they do that? Why? What was the objection to Assad? After all, the Assads had been in power for many years, 50 years. So what was the reason for that?
And the same leaders couldn't have used the human rights violations. Okay, I mean that's
Right.
yeah. Okay.
No, I mean, that's what I'm talking about, this whole Sadnaya kind of tsunami of nonsense is just too much, really, because we've gone all through this for the last 14 years, and pretty much all of the accusations against Assad have been
But why did they do it? What was the? I mean, we know about Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood, but why did the Saudis? Why did the United Arab Emirates? Why did they turn so vehemently against Assad?
Well, I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, Qatar was certainly leading it, but I mean, Saudi Arabia is the generator of the Wahhabis, for example. So a lot of the groups within Syria were Wahhabi. I think, we've talked about the harnessing of the Muslim Brotherhood communities across the world, and they are vast. So that entire complex in America was turned against Assad. Of course, you have the connection to the Palestinian resistance in Hamas. And under Khalid Mashal's leadership, of course, that Palestinian movement was weaponized against Assad And Hamas were actually involved in the destabilization of Syria because Mashal was leading. The leaders that were against that and were pro remaining within, let's say, the Iran sponsored or led resistance axis were either assassinated or they were sidelined by Mashal until about 2017 when Nasrallah started to normalize relations. In 2021, they came back to Damascus. But I think there was a lot of pressure from the West. I think at that point, there was this vision under Trump, for example, came later, I know, the Abraham Accords of this normalization with Israel, this acceptance into the kind of the US orbit inside, inside the Middle East. And for Saudi Arabia, it was about Iran, because this is also a power struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran to have the ultimate control of the region. Mm-hmm. That's been very clear. So you have the Sunni Islamist Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia, and in Iran, of course, the support for not only for the Shia and the Alawite and so on, but for the resistance. Mm-hmm. And so that's why Saudi Arabia was pulled into it. And then, of course, UAE were less involved, but then UAE were involved in providing the land bridge for Israel during the genocide in Palestine.
Mm-hmm. The saying, appetite comes with eating.
Yeah.
With the quote unquote, and I say this with inverted commas, with the wind to their back, there are reports, and of course this could be just propaganda used for propaganda purposes, but there's murmurings that Israel is going to now target Iran's nuclear infrastructure. When the only thing that the West has done in the Middle East since the accession of Israel is to cause chaos. Well, this is just more chaos. Okay, my point is that the timing of it all. I mean, in the matter of a few short hours, Syria's entire military-industrial complex was just obliterated. They're eyeing Lebanon. Iraq is on eggshells right now. I mean, I said from the very, very beginning, and I hate using October 7th as a benchmark, but we'll use it anyway. The resistance was hoping, at least many members of the resistance, hoping this would be the solution to the Zionist problem in the Middle East. But then again, Israel and its allies saw this attack on October 7th as an opportunity to solve all of their problems. Well, we know which side is solving their problems. That's why I'm bringing up Iran. Go ahead, Vanessa.
I think Iraq will be destabilized before they do anything major in Iran. That's my reading of it. Because if you look at how they've worked, okay, so you're right, since October the 7th, Palestine has been pretty much, I hate using these words, but I mean, what is it going to do now? And the fact is that Khalid Mashal is back at the helm now, that a deal will be made. And unfortunately, as I was speaking to an activist in West Bank, and as she said, we're just going to end up in smaller and smaller little concentration camps and even more apartheid, and we'll just be slave labor, basically. That's, pretty much what's heading their way. And then they moved on to Lebanon. And of course, they've achieved pretty much for the time being what they wanted to do there. Hezbollah have been pushed back to the north of the Litani River. The Lebanese army is in control of the south. And of course, if there are any Israeli violations, nothing's going to happen because they just report it to the US administrative officials and bodies in Lebanon, and nothing happens.
But Iraq is really an American project, and that's why I mean everything really is driven by the Americans. And it's a question of what is the Americans going to decide? Do the Americans want to cause chaos in Iraq? I would say yes, because that's just the American way. They want to create as much chaos as possible.
But if you look at what's been happening, what I'm saying is there's a pattern. Mm-hmm. So the pattern is to kind of finish Palestine, separate that from all the other members of the resistance axis, The same in Lebanon, separate it from the land bridge and from the weapons manufacturer. So that's it already weakened. Syria, the same, destroy its military infrastructure and its essential infrastructure, take its resources, partition it, turn it into sectarian statelets that if there are any remaining sects, they're going to be fighting each other for time immemorial, and including all the different gangs. Very soon, as we saw in all the occupied areas, they're going to be fighting each other for power and for status and so on. So it's just going to be a melting pot of endless conflicts now, which is what they love. It's chaos strategy, right? Close the border, so isolate Syria, and then move on to Iraq. This is the logic to me. So they will then do the same thing in Iraq. You've said it is still very much a colonized state, right? I mean, US still occupies, US still pretty much controls the governmental policy. Kurds have control over much of the resources. And what's going to stand in their way? The resistance factions, the PMUs, the Hashd al-Shabi, the Kaitab, Hezbollah, and so on. So I think they will continue in the same MO, one way or another.
And then I think Iran comes next, because again, there's so much opportunity in Iran. It's such a diverse country. You know, so many non-Persians live there, and you know, you can create all sorts of problems. You know, have nationalist, separatist movements and so on.
Really
so
big.
Rich pickings.
It's really
huge.
Big.
Yeah.
It's huge. Yeah, and incredibly diverse, you know, but it is neighbored by some very dangerous countries to Iran also. I mean, you know, you've got MEK operating out of various countries. You've got Azerbaijan, which is like kind of little Israel, really. You've got, you know, Pakistan. They've been attempting. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
We can go totally global now. All of this is, of course, in one way or another, and in the minds of others, very specifically, a anti-Russia gambit. This is they definitely want to humiliate the Russians in the Middle East and actually just completely throw them out. That is part of the Iran gambit, but also China is very, very important here. And the George loves to use the word caper, which I like using too. So I'm looking for a caper with Iraq and with Iran, because China is so very dependent on the energy exports from particularly, just the entire Gulf. You start messing around with that, and that's challenging and actually hemming in and containing China. And you know, I think most people, even if they agree or disagree with this, always trying to understand Chinese foreign policy is a bit of a mystery to me. Okay, because they don't really say very much.
Yeah, they don't do very much.
Don't do much either.
No, I mean, I met the Chinese ambassador in Damascus on a couple of occasions, and I have to say he never said anything. I mean, these were kind of social occasions. But he was extremely inscrutable. I mean, he never sort of added anything to the discussions with various Latin American ambassadors who were very open in their policies. And, you know, it was always an interesting people-watching experience to kind of see the difference.
My point is, all of these things are connected.
Of course.
And sometimes the bad guy wins.
Well, that's it. The United States kind of creates this empire of chaos, and in a way, we don't even have. They don't necessarily just have to target Iran. They could target the Gulf states. I mean, they don't particularly like MBS, you know, throwing his weight around and pretending to be some kind of a serious figure on the world scene. I mean, they could make life difficult for MBS in Saudi Arabia.
Even Jordan, because pressure could be brought on to take in refugees from Gaza, for example. You know, so there's all sorts of other kind of elements at play here that could lead to the putting on of pressure against Saudi Arabia.
And I'm sure the Americans were very pissed off when China brokered an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. You know, hey, where do you get off? You know, intervening here and making nice with Iran. You know, that's not something Americans are just going to put up with.
Vanessa, so much is going on, and George and I are very grateful that you told us about your personal experience. And thank you for being on with John Laughlin. That was a wonderful panel. But what about the Palestinians? I mean, this is the time,
Mm.
unfortunately, I feel it in my bones to complete the Zionist project in the British mandate, and that means because Jordan has already been mentioned here, pushing the Palestinians in the West Bank out, and of course the world has done nothing really for the Palestinians in Gaza. I suppose that genocide will be completed in one form or another, but the West Bank is definitely on the agenda with these nutcases in Netanyahu's government. I mean, I mean, if aliens are listening, they understand it. They telegraph it so much. Okay. I really
Mm.
do worry about the West Bank. I mean, the horrific
Thanks.
violence that on a daily basis. Okay. And, and a kind of an extra thought because I don't want to forget it. Al Jazeera scored a lot of points over the last 14 years with a lot of people around the world. How shameful they are today.
Yeah, of course.
They have just no intellectual integrity, any moral integrity, saying that these are different things when they're all about the same thing. It's a gut punch every time I watch them praise a black flag in Damascus.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I guess the first part, Palestinians.
well, first about Palestinians, I mean, we've been heading towards this awful dystopian vision of Netanyahu when he showed the blessing and the curse map that Gaza would basically become a series of concentration camps inside concentration camps. Those that refused to give up resistance would be shipped out. Now we think probably to Jordan because pressure will be put on Jordan to take them in, or else it will also come under attack and lose territory because HTS and Israel are now on their border, etc. West Bank, yes, of course, it's destined for more annexation. And then, of course, you bring in the India Middle East Economic Corridor. So from Mumbai through all of the Gulf states, through the occupied territories, Gaza will become the industrial free zone. And from there, everything will be shipped to El Arish in Egypt and then to Europe. And of course, using Palestinian gas off the coast of the occupied territories and off the coast of Gaza, but also they now have control over the gas reserves off the coast of Syria. And there are in that entire Levantine basin, of course. They don't yet have the control of the Lebanese, but potentially that's also what is in their agenda for the near future.
The
You said,
Turks.
you said that the Jordanians would come under pressure to take Palestinians. Will Egypt also come under pressure to take the Palestinians? Serious pressure. In other words, pressure that they can't resist.
I'm not sure about Egypt because Egypt has this role very much in this economic corridor. And Egypt, the Sinai is already effectively owned lock, stock, and barrel by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and they will be developing as part of that trade zone to take commodities into Europe from India and through the Gulf states and so on. So I'm not sure Egypt will come under that amount of pressure, to be honest. I think it's more likely to be Jordan, because also Jordan, of course, it's the majority of its population came originally from Palestine.
Yeah, but I mean, I mean, is anybody gonna pay for it, or are the Jordanians gonna have to take? I mean, the West never pays.
Well,
I mean, the West may destroy a place and then bilk the taxpayer to help rebuild it so they can destroy it again. But I mean, I don't know. Jordan is just such a pathetic place. I mean, I'm actually surprised
agreed.
they Palestinians in the West Bank haven't already been forced there. The king can make great speeches at the United Nations, but other than
Oh,
that,
I mean, he's just a vassal state. It's a vassal state of the British, actually, historically, of course. No, I mean, I think they'll be accommodated, but they'll be accommodated in refugee camps and makeshift. They're not going to be given any particular amenities and so on. I don't think. I don't see
But
that happening.
the refugee camps in Jordan, they're going to be dumped in Jordan primarily.
I think so. Yeah, from how I'm reading it, not in Egypt, because in Egypt that's going to upset the plans for the economic corridor. Because if you've suddenly got an entire tented city on the area where you want to bring investors and so on, that doesn't look great. Jordan is separate to all of that. You know, the optics aren't good. The optics are fine in Jordan because nobody's really going to get involved in that.
All right, last question. Many on American campuses, young people find themselves in trouble with university administrators and possibly even with a Trump FBI for using the phrase from the river to the sea. But this is what we're seeing. We're seeing the Zionist project from the river to the sea. I suppose that won't be penalized speech in the future.
Well, it was like, yeah, I mean, it was actually a Likud statement,
Yeah,
I think, back in the mid 80s. That's where it originated from.
All right.
And
Well,
of course, you know, yeah, go on, sorry.
no, Vanessa, this is thank you so much for giving us your time. I really appreciate it. I know you have a lot of calls on your time, and so thank you for for giving us all your insights. Your firsthand impression. So that really was very valuable to us. So thank you, Vanessa, and I'm sure we're going to have you on again very, very soon. So all the best.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
remember,
both.
if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.